I noticed the way his eyes went to the bookshelves before they ever came to me, and I told myself I was imagining things. My son had been dating him for 14 months. 14 months of Sunday dinners and holiday cards, and me trying, really trying, to find something to love about a man who made my son laugh like that. And I did find things. He was charming in the way that well-practiced people are charming. He remembered how I took my coffee. He complimented the garden without being asked. But his eyes always went to the bookshelves first. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a family law attorney in Charlotte, North Carolina before I retired. I have sat across the table from people who smiled while they were lying to me, and I have learned the hard way through years of depositions and discovery and documents that don't match what someone told me under oath, that charm is a skill, not a character trait. Anyone can learn it. The question is why they had to. My son's name is Tobias. He's 34, soft-spoken, the kind of man who still calls me on Sundays even when there's nothing particular to say. He teaches middle school science in Asheville and coaches the robotics club on Thursday afternoons because nobody else would, and he does it without telling anyone it's a sacrifice. He is the best thing I ever made, and I say that as a woman who also built a career and a home and a vegetable garden that has genuinely never failed me in 20 years. His father died 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We had been married 28 years, and I won't pretend I didn't fall apart because I did. But I put myself back together the way I always have, slowly, deliberately, one thing at a time. The house was paid off. The retirement accounts were solid. I had the cabin up in Boone that Thomas and I had bought in our 40s, our someday place, our reward for all of it place. I leased it as a vacation rental after he died because I couldn't bear to be there without him, and it did well enough that I stopped thinking about money the way I used to. All of that to say, I was not a woman without resources, and the people in Tobias's life knew it. I first met my son's partner, I'll call him what Tobias called him, his boyfriend, though by the time all of this happened the word felt like something that needed washing at Thanksgiving 2 years ago now. Tobias had been careful not to bring anyone home before that. He'd dated quietly for years and I'd respected it, never pushed. So when he called in October and said, "Mom, I want you to meet someone, I think this is real," I felt something open up in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel again. His name was Callum, 31 years old, worked in commercial real estate development in Charlotte. Handsome in that particular way that knows it's handsome. He brought wine to Thanksgiving, a nice bottle, which I noted, and he shook my hand with both of his and said it was such an honor to finally meet me that Tobias talked about me constantly. We sat down to dinner, and within 40 minutes he had asked me 3 questions about the cabin. How long had I had it? What was the square footage? Was the rental income steady year-round? Or mostly seasonal, I answered. Of course I answered. I told myself it was small talk, that people in real estate ask about property the way doctors ask about your sleep habits. Occupational reflex. Tobias was glowing across the table, and I was not going to dim that for him over dinner conversation. But I counted. 3 questions in 40 minutes, I started counting. By Christmas, it was 11. Across 2 visits, he never asked about Thomas. Never asked about my career or what it had been like to practice family law or whether I missed it. He asked about the cabin's HOA structure. He asked whether I'd ever considered converting the rental to a long-term lease. He asked once, in a voice designed to sound casual, whether I'd updated my estate documents since Thomas passed. Tobias was in the kitchen when he asked that last one, just the 2 of us by the fireplace, the way you engineer a private conversation. I looked at him for a moment before I answered. I keep those things current, I said. Old habit. He smiled. Of course, smart woman, smart woman. I turned back to the fire and thought, you have no idea. I didn't say anything to Tobias yet. I want to be clear about that because people always ask why I waited, why I didn't go to him immediately, and the answer is both simple and complicated. Simple. I had no proof. Complicated. I know my son. He was in love, the eyes bright, calls twice a week, laughs at everything, kind of in love. And if I had walked up to him in month 4 and said, "I think your boyfriend is casing your inheritance," I would have lost him. Not permanently. But I would have driven him toward Callum and away from me, and I couldn't afford that. I needed him close. So instead, I did what I did for 31 years. I gathered information. I called a colleague of mine, a woman I'd worked with in the 90s who now ran a small private investigations firm in Raleigh. I told her what I had. She told me it wasn't much. I told her I knew that and to find me more. What she found over the next 8 weeks was this. Callum had been in a previous long-term relationship with a man 12 years his senior who owned a significant amount of commercial property in the Triad area. That relationship had ended badly. The ex-partner had confided to a mutual acquaintance that Callum had pressured him to co-sign a refinancing agreement, and that when he refused, things deteriorated quickly. No legal action had been taken. People rarely take legal action against someone they loved. She also found that Callum's firm was not doing as well as he implied. He was not a partner. He was a mid-level associate, and his expenses, his apartment in Southend, the car, the wardrobe, did not map cleanly onto his salary. I sat with that information for 2 weeks. I updated my will quietly with my own attorney, specifying clearly that the cabin and its rental income were to remain in a trust I controlled. I moved my most liquid assets into an account Tobias didn't know about, not because I didn't trust my son, but because I didn't want documents with my name on them sitting in a house where Callum spent 3 nights a week. I had always kept physical copies of my deeds and financial statements in a lockbox in my home office. I moved that lockbox. Old habit. In March, Tobias called on a Sunday, our Sunday call, and I could tell from the first hello that something was different. He was doing that thing he's done since he was 9 years old, where he talks too fast when he's nervous, where he covers the real thing with 3 other things first. He told me about school, about a student who'd won a regional science competition, about a restaurant he and Callum had tried on Friday. And then, barely breathing, "Mom, we're getting engaged. I wanted you to hear it from me first." I said yes. I held the phone very still. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, "tell me everything." I did not tell him what I knew. Not yet. Not on that call, not on the 3 that followed. I asked about the ring, about the proposal, about whether they'd talked about a timeline. I showed up. I was present. I was his mother. But I called my colleague back the next morning and told her I needed everything she could find, as fast as she could find it. What came back 10 days later was worse than I'd expected. Callum had a second phone. My colleague had not been able to access its contents. She was careful to stay on the right side of legal, but she had identified through carrier records that it existed and was registered under a variation of his middle name. She had also tracked down, through a real estate industry contact, that Callum had recently consulted with a property attorney in Charlotte about the process of adding a spouse's name to a property deed in North Carolina, specifically regarding inherited and separately held assets. For anyone who doesn't know North Carolina property law, in this state, inherited property and property owned before marriage generally remain separate property even after you marry. It cannot automatically pass to a spouse. But there are ways to commingle it, to blur those lines, if you're patient and if the other person trusts you. A spouse with access to documents can cause a great deal of damage even without a signature. He was not asking idle questions about real estate. He was researching a strategy. I drove to Asheville on a Wednesday. I didn't tell Tobias I was coming. I had a key. I've always had a key, and I let myself in at 2 in the afternoon when I knew he'd be at school and Callum would be at work. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I want to be honest about that. I was looking to understand the shape of the thing I was dealing with. What I found was on the kitchen counter, not hidden, just sitting there, the way things sit when you've stopped worrying about being found out. A printed email, face up, from Callum to someone named T. Alcott at a law firm I didn't recognize in Charlotte. The email referenced a timeline. It referenced the Boone property. It referenced accelerating the documentation process before the ceremony. I took a photograph of it with my phone. I set it back down exactly as I'd found it. I made myself a cup of tea, sat in my son's kitchen for 20 minutes, and then I drove home. I did not sleep that night. The wedding date had been set for the first Saturday in October at a venue outside Asheville that overlooked the mountains. Tobias had been planning it with more joy than I'd ever seen him apply to anything. He'd sent me fabric swatches. He'd asked me to help choose the flowers. He'd asked if I would speak at the rehearsal dinner. I said yes to all of it, and I started building my case. My attorney connected me with a forensic document specialist. My colleague's contact at the law firm turned out to know the T. Alcott referenced in the email a real estate and estate planning attorney who, when approached carefully by my colleague with a cover story, confirmed that she had been engaged by a client to research property transfer mechanisms for a blended estate situation in Watauga County. That's where Boone is. That's where my cabin is. My attorney filed a protective notice on the cabin's deed. Quiet, preemptive. The kind of thing that makes it very difficult for anyone to initiate a transfer process without my active, witnessed, notarized involvement. Then I waited. I want to tell you about the months between March and October because I think people imagine that what I was doing was cold, strategic, that I was operating like a lawyer and not like a mother. And I understand why it might look that way, but what I actually remember from those months is the weight of it. Sitting across from my son at dinners I'd cooked for him, watching him be happy, watching him talk about his future with a man who was planning to hollow that future out and saying nothing, because saying something too soon would end everything. He brought Callum to my house in July, a long weekend. I made the peach cobbler Tobias has loved since he was small, and I watched Callum eat 2 helpings and compliment me generously. And I smiled and thanked him, and I thought about the email on the kitchen counter, and I did not let my smile shift by a single degree. That is not coldness. That is the hardest thing I have ever done. 2 weeks before the wedding, I had the conversation with my attorney that I'd been building toward for 7 months. Everything was in order. The protective filing was in place. The evidence was documented. The second phone's existence was confirmed. The prior relationship and the pressure tactics were on record. She told me I had enough to go to Tobias with, more than enough. I drove to Asheville on a Thursday evening. I texted him to say I was coming, that I needed to talk to him, that it was important. He met me at the door looking worried, and I felt that worry like a stone in my chest because I was the one who had put it there. We sat at his kitchen table, the same table where the email had been, though it was long gone by then, and I laid it out for him. All of it. The questions that started at Thanksgiving, the investigation, the prior relationship, and what the ex-partner had said. The second phone, the email, the attorney in Charlotte and what she'd asked to research, the filing I'd made on the cabin. I had it all printed and organized in a folder because I am who I am and I needed him to see it rather than just hear it. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "How long have you known?" "Since December," I said. "I'm sorry I waited. I needed to be certain before I hurt you." He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them. He said, "I need you to leave." I left. I drove home and I sat in my kitchen and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since Thomas died. Because even when you do the right thing, even when you protect someone you love from something real, there is a version of it that feels like devastation. He didn't call for 4 days. On the 5th day, a Saturday, my phone rang at 6 in the morning. It was Tobias. And the first thing he said was, "I found the other phone." He had found it himself. I don't know exactly how. He's never told me all of it, but I know that after I left that Thursday, he started looking. And what he found on that second phone was enough that he didn't need anything else. Conversations with people I didn't know. Discussions of a timeline that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with property. Plans made in the language of someone who had calculated a return. He confronted Callum that Friday evening. Callum denied it at first, then he minimized it. Then he said things that Tobias has never repeated to me in full, but that I know, from the way my son's voice sounds when the subject comes up, were cruel in a very specific way, the cruelty of someone who feels entitled to what they thought they were about to get. Tobias asked him to leave. He left. The wedding was called off on Sunday. Tobias handled the vendors, the venue, the guests. He is organized and capable and his father's son, and he did it with a steadiness that made me ache with something that was grief and pride at the same time. We didn't talk much in those first weeks. He needed space, and I gave it to him, and I tried not to think too hard about whether I had handled it right, whether there was a better way or a kinder one, whether I should have gone to him sooner or later or differently. In November, he drove up to Charlotte on a Sunday, and we sat in the kitchen, and I made coffee, and we didn't talk about Callum at all. We talked about his students, about the robotics club, about a hiking trail he wanted to try in the spring. Before he left, standing at the front door in his coat, he hugged me for a long time, longer than usual, and he said into my shoulder, "I'm glad you were paying attention." "I'm your mother," I said. "It's the only job I've never retired from." He laughed. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh since October. The cabin is still mine. I still rent it out, mostly to families in the summer and couples in the fall when the leaves turn. Sometimes I drive up there myself just for a weekend, and I sit on the porch in the evening and watch the ridge go dark and think about Thomas and about Tobias and about what it means to protect the things you've spent a lifetime building. Not the property, not the accounts, not the deed with my name on it, the actual things. The peach cobbler recipe I learned from my grandmother. The Sunday calls that never really have a reason. The boy who grew into a man who still needs his mother sometimes, even when he doesn't know it yet. Those are the things worth protecting. Everything else is just paper.